Buckle up, Camp Pros, and get ready to launch into the future of summer camp with Camp Ahead. Camp Ahead helps Camp Pros think about the future so they're not caught off guard. Climate mitigation, heat, gender, war, demographics, economics, artificial intelligence. Are we ready as an industry? Camp Ahead, exploring the futurology of the summer camp industry. You can find our contact information and the many show notes from each episode at gocamp.pro/campahead.
Is creating your camp schedule a headache? Does it limit the experience of campers or staff? Campify is a software that does the heavy lifting for you, taking care of group, elective, and specialist scheduling based on your custom scheduling rules. Interested in learning more? Visit campify.io/campahead to schedule a demo or create a free trial today.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Camp Ahead. My name is Jess Roberts. I'm the Executive Director of Episcopal Camp and Conference Centers.
My name's Joe Richards. I am the Executive Director at Pierce Williams Summer Camp and Retreat Facility, which is affiliated with the United Church of Canada's camps, which there's 50 plus United Church camps across Canada. And Pierce Williams is located about halfway between Detroit and Toronto for your reference.
Hi, everybody. My name is KJ Williams. I am the Chief Program Officer and Camp Director at Phantom Lake YMCA Camp in Mugwanago, Wisconsin.
Awesome. Representing the Midwest. I'm from Chicago, so anytime we can talk about the Midwest, I'm here for it. Today, we're going to be talking about developing diverse scenarios. And so kind of to recap a little bit of what we've been doing, we have been talking about scenario planning. And this is thinking about in the camp world, planning not just for today or next week or next year, but looking really at the future. What's 5, 10, 20 years down the line? And we're looking at a book called Imaginable. And do you have a copy of that you can show? Joe always has it nearby.
I do.
This is a phenomenal book. You can get it at your local bookstore. You can get it digitally. You can get it at your library. It's a wonderful book that helps you kind of look at what does it look like to imagine a future when, and how to use your brain and your creativity to think through things that haven't happened. And so we kind of looked at what that looked like. Then we talked about key drivers. So that could be something like economic, environment, or social that could change the camp industry. And what we're looking at today is how do we develop a diverse scenario? How do we take that scenario and how do we look at it and how do we build a narrative from it? And so why don't we start by talking about...
Can I talk a little bit about I just flipped it open. I flipped open the book to chapter 4. And I'm not saying we're not doing this series of podcasts isn't chapter by chapter. It would be very interesting to do this as a book club with other camp professionals. That would be a different view.
Yeah.
But the title of chapter 4 is Be Ridiculous at First. And the quote that starts it is, every now and then, one's mind is stretched by a new idea or sensation and never shrinks back to its former dimensions. And I think that really illustrates what I'm talking about when I talk about scenario planning with people, is that we are looking to stretch people's imaginations and minds so that you're always thinking about something in the future and how you can make it better. And once again, just to reiterate and update people, we're not trying to predict the future. We're trying to create multiple possible futures, and then your camp, you can guide your camp on how to move forward towards a possible future that you most want to come true. And I think that's helpful for people who haven't listened to other episodes.
Yeah. I love this idea of being ridiculous at first.
Yeah.
Because we sometimes in the camp world get so used to thinking of planning for the futures that we already know, or the things that make sense. Like we might not be able to find male counselors, and like we know that, and we've made provisions for that or other things. But what does it look like to think about something that maybe just seems totally ridiculous right now? And in the improv world, we do this thing, we talk about the unusual thing, and we say like, okay, if that's real, if that is true, then what? And then going from there. And so I love that idea of a useful statement about the future should at first seem ridiculous.
Yeah. One of the things as we get into this week's episode is that there is a tool, and we'll make sure this tool is in the show notes, but Urgent Optimists, which is a a public-facing group that was based around the book Imaginable. Urgent Optimists, they created a chatbot essentially in Poe, which is an AI that allows you to do a scenario, right? So, or allows you to more easily it comes up with with scenarios. So it talks in terms of, you could tell me, it says, and I'm reading from the screen, a future of shoes scenario related to extreme weather PTSD, or a future of food scenario related to aging populations, or a future of music scenario related to women's equality and political action. And the AI will take those things and tell you and create a scenario for you. I have been playing with it for months now, on and off. One of the first ones I typed in was the future of children's cancer camps related to the cure of cancer,
Mm.
right? What happens to cancer camps if cancer is cured,
Yeah.
right? So in those big terms, do either of you two have some other big things that you think?
Yeah, I mean, we had talked about it in the past, those key drivers, those big things that Jess was naming, the social, emotional, economic, all of those things and possibilities. And in the camp realm, we've talked about mental health being one of those big factors. And so I've been playing with this AI, this scenario planner as well, with a couple different scenarios regarding mental health, right? And almost being what seems like ridiculous and saying nobody can have medication on camp anymore. What does that scenario look like, right? There's no such thing as a break anymore. What does that scenario look like, and how that affects mental health and creating scenarios for the camp world in those aspects?
I actually started thinking about recently what would happen if technology and internet doesn't work. It's on and off. We can't trust it. Like the capacity breaks. And what happens to your camp if you have started to really utilize the internet for safety, or your radios, things like that? And what happens if we can't rely on them because they break all the time?
And in that scenario, Jess, we're slowly getting to the age point where those of us like myself who grew up and ran camps with no internet are
Mhm.
going to eventually age out of the workforce.
Yeah.
Because if the internet stopped working, I know how to run camp because I've done
Yep.
it, right? Like
Yep.
that's a thing. And young people are like, well, we've always had this. And I was like, always is a personal
We
perspective.
when I first started, we had a weather radio.
Yeah, yeah.
And we had a guy on our staff, and he would come in and he would tell us the weather for the day, and we all thought he just went out and looked at the sun and like looked at the sky and was like, it's gonna rain today. And we were like, wow, Richard knows everything. No, he had a weather radio.
It's
I'm in my
funny.
late I'm in my late 20s and I'm like, no internet on camp? Oh my gosh, it's giving me heart palpitations. I'm like, how would I run camp? I know
Well,
it's possible, but I don't want to do it.
Yeah, my big piece is just about safety. We had
Sure.
walkie-talkies, and that's how we communicated with each other. And actually, still lots of camps do that because cell phone coverage doesn't work in a
Mm-hmm.
lot of places. But what happens if you can't even rely on a walkie-talkie? And but you're right, Joe, like there has been so much transition in the past 20 years within the camp industry. And what happens if technology, we just can't rely on it? And if all the people who knew that way have aged out, how do we prepare a new generation to be able to run camp that way?
because we're discussing diverse scenarios, let's dig deeper into this one because I think once you start thinking about a scenario for your own camp or for your own industry, if you're not a camp and you're listening to this, technology also is affected by the fact that we no longer have databases that are locally hosted,
Mm-hmm.
right? All of our databases for camps, be it CampBrain or CampMinder or UltraCamp, those are all hosted somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
So if it stopped working now, I'm not even sure I have all of the emergency contact information for those
Right.
kids to
Mm-hmm.
call. And if technology fails, our cell tower is going to fail, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I often think about our landline here at camp
Mm-hmm.
and how frustrating it is that our pool requires a landline due to health things and emergencies. But when the power goes out, the landline still works. Like, and
Mm,
that's one of the keys to this whole, yeah, like locally hosted stuff, right? All of your documents that are in the cloud, KJ, just disappear. How do
Mhm.
you
right.
feel? How's that, man?
Well,
How's your heart beating now?
woo! We have a records room on camp, and I'm like, I don't even know how to navigate that thing. Those paper documents? No thanks.
My
Yeah,
my brain goes to, oh well, we back everything up on
Sure,
a hard drive, but then I
sure.
think, okay, so you've got the hard drive, but what if the computer doesn't work?
Yep.
yeah. It is, and this is where when we come up with various scenarios, so this is one. I
Mhm.
think there's a benefit in a group of people, like-minded people or slightly different people, different generations of people as well, coming together and talking about a scenario like that. Because there's
Mhm.
lots of people who I think just are going to throw their head in the sand and say, well, that's never going to happen. Have we not watched enough dystopian? And we're recording this um, the day after South Korean's president declared martial law.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't know that story, you can look that up on the internet. But essentially, it was corrected by the parliament there. And but this is a whole thing. What happens? And I was just wondering, like, what happens if martial law is declared? How does that affect summer camp, right? And I was like, because there are South Korean summer camps, right?
Mhm.
And this is where I'm like, these are scenarios where you're like, oh, that would never happen. You're like, well,
Yeah.
And that's why I think like this week is such an or this episode is really important because it's thinking about one, thinking about the ridiculous because it could happen, but
Sure.
it also could not happen. But that's part of it is getting your brain just thinking about these kind of things. And so today I'm like, okay, so what do we do? We start with an idea, a ridiculous idea, and then how do we go about it? What do we do? So if we're thinking about like mental health and not being able to get any medication on camp, or if we're thinking about 10 years from now, technology, internet just doesn't work. What
yeah.
what's the next step?
Well, and I think KJ, talk more about your scenario and how about the medication part.
Yeah, it was just when we were thinking about worst case scenarios, best case scenarios, ridiculousness, one of the things I could think of was what would be a worst case scenario in the realm of mental health? And I was
Mhm.
like, oh, all of my staff, campers, etc., that take antidepressants, that take what some type of medication in regards to psychiatric meds, something like that, they don't have access to that. How then would that adjust the way my staff is doing their job, the way my campers interact with each other, the way everyone interacts with each other? The already camp is very overstimulating. How would that affect stimulation? I mean, that was that to me, I was like, that is a worst case scenario. I know that I take medication and it is my lifesaver. I love my meds, right? And the way that I would react if I didn't have my meds in this very go, go, go summer world would be drastically different. So imagine that times 100 staff and 200 campers. What would that look like? And how drastically would that affect camp and affect everyone's time on camp? So when I ran that through the scenario, our great AI scenario generator, I'm reading through it. It said, what the questions were like, what initial actions would you take to adapt, prepare, and help yourself and help others? And so those were the questions that I've been I've been reflecting on.
Mhm.
Because again, like we said in our last episode, we don't have the answers, but this is at least giving us that topic of conversation to start thinking, like Jess said, about what it could look like going forward.
Yeah, and the longer, if you're using the Urgent Optimist scenario creator, you can continue that conversation with it.
Mm,
Today, now it's on Poe, which is it limits you to a certain amount. Apparently, today I've used lots. I only have 16% of my points remaining, which I'm not there all the time, so it's on an, but like it starts, you can go with big things. So I think about scenarios in terms of like, there's the big things that are outside of our control. And I think that's one of the better, well, most of these scenarios will be things that we can't control. So if medication, or if the technology fails, or if climate storm happens, or if, right, like immigration changes, all of those things. But I played with it in terms of smaller scenarios to us. What does three camps merging look like? And what are the things I should pay attention to? What's my daily life look like 10 years from now if I'm overseeing three camps, right? What happens if your camp gets $1 million donation and you're not, what's different in 10 years? And this is where you can use artificial intelligence to help with this, but you can also do this with a group of people and talk it through. What happens, and I was saying earlier before we started recording, what happens if you get an endowment fund that is funded, that means funded to the tune that it covers your annual operating budget, right? And how would that change the way that I run Pierce Williams if I had $700,000 a year just coming in from the interest from an endowment fund? What would we do differently, right? And those are and do differently 10 years from now. How would that affect us, and what would it look like, and go from there? So
So I think one of the things that I heard, if you don't use the AI, how do we do this? Okay, so KJ came up with a great scenario idea. So the next step is coming up with these questions, I would say, right? And so what are the type of questions that we should be thinking about if we come up with a scenario? If we're somebody who doesn't have AI access to it, or somebody who feels like I don't want to be using AI because I know how much energy it takes and electricity. So how do we do this without it as well? Or if you're in my world, in this scenario that I magically came up with, well, you can't use internet, so I might as well not use it to help with this scenario planning. How do we do it without it?
I would create a story about that scenario.
Yep.
A pre-story, and it doesn't need to be like 10 pages. It just needs to be a couple of paragraphs to put people so that they can imagine themselves in this place. So the year is 2020 or 2034, and you show up at camp, and there's been a medication shortage for months, which means you're going to have a bunch of people who come to camp with no meds. That might be, and then a lot of the scenarios, whether they're created by AI or whether they're in the book, or start with a how do you feel, right? Like what is use one word to describe how you feel if you're overseeing three camps. Well, I feel stressed. That's like, if I feel stressed overseeing one camp, why wouldn't I feel more stressed overseeing three camps, right? And I think that's sort of the thought right away, is to write the story and have a simple question to get people engaged.
Wonderful. All right, so let's do that. KJ, there's a shortage and it's bad, and you've got camp still is happening because it is a great place. It's a great outlet. We know being out in the woods is actually really good for our health. We're going to camp. How do you feel as the camp director in this situation?
I mean, I think I would be overwhelmed, would be the one word I would use.
I think, like, in my perspective, if it was me currently, it's someone who doesn't take, I take heartburn medication, but that would suck. But baking soda would solve a lot of that problem. I already know the solution. Part of me is like, knowing the research, it's also how we, overwhelmed isn't what I feel. What I feel is like the need for adjustment, because we know that nature can offer some of the medication value.
Sure.
As long as we switch our programming up so people are in nature more than in a building.
In this situation, one of the questions that comes to mind is, who's in power and how connected are they to mental health? For example, if you have somebody who has no personal experience with it, they might be making decisions without thinking through things because it's not a part of their day, right? It's not a part of the way their brain works. And so you have to think about who are the stakeholders who are helping to make the decisions. That's the thing that comes to my mind. And if that group of people doesn't experience or have anything but like basic training, how do we get people in that group to help with the decision making? The other like big thing that popped in my mind was withdrawal. People who, there are lots of medications that the first thing that happens when you don't take it isn't like you just feel depressed again. It's actually you go through withdrawal from not taking the medication. You get dizzy, you get nauseous. So thinking through how is that going to affect the withdrawal symptoms of having a successful or a safe session of camp.
Well, then how long has this been going on, right?
Yeah.
Is it
Oh, good
within,
question. Yeah.
because if we knew this, if this happens in September for North American camps, right? If this happens in September, October, we have months to think about these solutions. But if the shortage occurs in
May or
May
June. Yeah.
or June or partway through our summers, right? So in here we do July and August. So let's say all medication disappears as of, right? Like if you had no time to plan, I think I can't understate the idea of stakeholders, right? Like that you were saying, Jess, is that I would need to bring in, and I hope that I would be in the place to say, oh, let's ask people who this actually affects, right? Like,
Mhm.
and see how they see a solution for themselves.
And what resources has the scientific community, like doctors or mental health experts, what resources have they been putting out to help with this? Like, let's ask the people who have spent their life's work or years studying it, get them as a stakeholder as well.
And do you have those people on your like, do you already have people on your call list who you could have reached out to say, hey, what's our mental health crisis plan look like now that a ton of people are going to be freaked out that they don't have medication? Because I would make an assumption, only an assumption, that if you feel like the medication is your lifesaver, that when you can see the medication running out, that it's people are just going to become worse and worse. Not the withdrawal part, that's still to come, but literally the anxiety of thinking about not having medication to help the anxiety, right? Like,
right. And then
Absolutely.
what does your health team look like, right? Is your health team an EMT? Is your health team college students? Is your health team, what does your health team look like? And how does that need to adjust? Are these, I have great RNs, but are they trained in mental health as well as physical health? And how is that going to affect everything? Because these are going to be your point people when you get to camp, right?
yes, but and then the other thought that just happened is what happens to the black market of these medication? Because somebody's going to see this coming and they're going to hoard this medication. And then are your staff or campers or camper parents buying black market medication that they don't know if it's really what is helping them? Oh my
Right.
God.
They don't know what's in it. And then the
Oh my
question
God.
is, are you allowing campers or staff to have medication that maybe is in fact the medication they need, but it hasn't been prescribed by a doctor because the only way they could get it was through back channels. So then you have to make these decisions on, well, that may be best for the said staff or said camper, but how can we trust that? And also, is that equitable because you were able to afford that medication and camper Taylor has no access to it? And so now you've got, wow, the power plays that can happen with that kind of.
Totally. And how's that going to affect your ACA accreditation, your day camp state licensing, all of that, right?
Insurance.
Is that going to adjust? Yep, insurance. Wow.
Yeah, and the longer you talk through a scenario like we're doing, the more things that come to mind where you're like, holy crap. But I think a couple episodes, was it the last episode or 2 episodes ago, KJ, you're like, well, what's the positive side of this? Right? Like,
yeah, I wrote it down. Yeah, you don't always have to have a negative trajectory.
So is there is there a positive side to that? Because you had said earlier you wrote out a worst case scenario.
Yeah, wrote out. I think a positive to this is the the possible, and I'm a verbal processor, so I'm processing out loud as
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
talking. I think one of the positives is like we really could adjust on-site in-person mental health needs with like having a therapist on site, adjusting break times, adjusting schedules, adjusting the things you had mentioned, like adjusting the program so we're spending more time in nature. We're getting those outlets and those coping skills somewhere else since we have to compensate for a lack of medication. And that I may maybe not a problem solver, but it could be a positive upside to this.
And I think it's interesting thinking about like about this because we're thinking worst case scenario, but then you think, but out of these,
Mm,
there are some, there could be some wonderful tools that could happen from there,
yeah,
like you were saying. Because I think about COVID, and there were lots of things that happened that came out of that were positive.
totally.
And I think because people realize, like, I mean, I myself, I was like, I got to make the best of what I have. And how do I do that? And sometimes the only way you can change is when you're put into a scenario like that. Like I think about schools, and I was teaching high school at the time, and we weren't teaching online. We hadn't moved at all that way. And I think the only way that schools could have been pushed towards doing online teaching or being flexible in that way was through this awful thing. And now we've shown that it is possible. It may not be the best, but it is possible to do online learning. And actually, we found in some cases, it was better for some students.
Hmm.
Not majority, but there were some kids and adults who were in college that it actually helped. But we would have never known that. And
No,
now schools are prepared if it happens. Sorry, go ahead, Joe.
but you also wouldn't have known that working from home can be more productive for some workers, right?
Yes.
You also, it's funny because chapter 11 of the book talks about simulating any future you want. So if you do have the book, that there's a walkthrough on how to do it. But it opens up with a quote that says, if there's one lesson to take away from the pandemic, it's the importance of looking ahead,
Mm-hmm.
not just looking ahead, but feeling ahead by imagining together in structured ways and creating the experience of change before it happens rather than rather than while it's happening. We have a hope of planning and even affecting our future. And that's really where I want to go. And listen, I have sat at tables with other camp professionals and talked about doing exactly what the three of us are doing here, which is talk about scenario planning and the importance of this for our industry. And I
Mm.
cannot understate how important I think this is for summer camp because we were not ready for the pandemic. But the more things we can think through, so there's the small things, as I said, right? The things that are camp specific, from donations to mergers to death of a executive director, all of those
Mm-hmm.
things, those are scenarios you can imagine. The bigger things, what is happening out there in the world, like a martial law being declared by the president of South Korea and you're a Korean camp, right? What you can't predict that, but even just to think it through stretches your brain a little bit to help you see that there's always a what if. Yeah.
Well, and there's also this piece too, which you sort of talked about. So I think about if at some point there were a future with medication shortage, it's like, okay, that may or may not happen, but what is something I could do that could help move towards better mental health that I can do now?
Yep.
And we were talking about this when we weren't recording, but one of the things is there's this employee assistant plan, right? That a lot of full-time employees get. And a lot of it is access to therapy, access to sometimes financial support of like financial planning. And so what if seasonal employees could have access to EAP? Could that positively affect a summer camp? If they could have access to a virtual counselor once a week that's a professional therapist, how would that affect camp? And so I thinking about like these situations and saying like, okay, we can plan for that too, but then it also makes me think, what
What
are
can
some
I
steps? What can I do now?
What's the now?
And that's a huge part of scenario planning. And there's also post. So we think one thing, right? Giving them access is enough, right? My experience is we had that access this year. There was funds from a local region that 10 camps could just call a psychologist if they ever needed them. And she was not utilized. And it's fascinating. Summer camp directors, listen up. What if I told you there was a magical tool that could transform your camp scheduling chaos into a breeze? Introducing Campify, a camp scheduling platform making scheduling as fun as camp itself. Before you hit skip, hear us out. Campify isn't just another app, it's your new secret weapon to conquer scheduling chaos. Camps across North America wish they tried it sooner, and none would ever go back to scheduling the old-fashioned way. Every camp is unique and it has its own special quirks. Campify gets that, and it works and thinks for you. It builds schedules based on rules that you set, and Campify offers much more than group scheduling. Campify's elective module gives campers personalized schedules. Say goodbye to last-minute changes causing scrambling and confusion. Campify's staff mobile app updates schedules in real time. Your time is valuable. Let Campify save you hours and make the scheduling effortless. Bring your camp into the future and discover the smarter way to schedule. Visit campify.io/campahead to schedule a demo. Create a free trial and claim 10% off your first year's license.
That reminds me of when something terrible happens in your life. Like let's say I lost a friend, a really good friend, and people are like, let me know if you need anything. That is not helpful. Why is it not helpful? Because I don't know what I need. So when somebody gives me access to something that I've never had before, and I don't know how to use it, I don't know that I need it or even want to think about it. So what's the next step for us so if people do have access, or if your camp hires a mental health advocate, how do we utilize that to introduce people to it who've never had it before and don't even realize like, oh wow, this is great. It's like I remember going to therapy for the first time and thinking, why isn't everybody in therapy? Like, because people think that it's just when you only go when you have this terrible, horrible thing happen. But if you're exposed to this thing that can just, I think of therapy as like you've embroidery floss and you're making friendship bracelets and it gets here. And I think of therapy as just actually putting the embroidery floss back together and separating it from all that gets stuck together and putting it back in its own. And so like in your situation, Joe, you have access to it. And how do we show or introduce to people who've never had it, or there's been a stigma around it, that it can be such an outlet and a resource for people?
And also time, utilizing time as a tool, right? Like I remember when I came in and I made adjustments to the schedule, and the first year everyone was like, these suck. This is not how we do camp, which is a common thing I think a lot of people here in the camp world is this is not how we do it here.
Right.
And then the next year I kept the schedule change and it got a little bit easier. And then the next year I kept the schedule change and everyone was like, yeah, we've always done it this way. Of course, right?
Yeah.
So utilizing that time to be like, yeah, this mental health representative or this access to therapy or whatever it is has been here for a few years, and once people start to get comfortable with it, they utilize it more. So knowing that just because it doesn't work immediately doesn't mean it won't
Yes.
work.
You got to
Yeah.
commit to it for a time because it's going to
Totally.
take a while. Like I remember instituting nap time at my camp, like called it siesta. And the director was like, this is not a great idea. Why are we doing this? And within 2 sessions, he was like, best idea ever. We had this
Yep.
thing where like you would be known by your best idea ever. And mine was putting nap time at camp.
You guys didn't have rest hour? We've always had rest hour.
Yeah.
We did not. Well, no, we had like quiet time, but
Mhm.
it was not, it became just like cabin
Film
free choice
film
kind
time,
of,
yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
instead of actually like
Forced nap time. Yeah.
That's
flat FOB, flat on bunk, or
yeah,
whatever
Yep.
you
yeah.
want to call it.
Yep.
One of the things, KJ, is the phrase "we've always done it that way." Those are the last words of dying churches, right?
Yep.
Like that's the way we think
Mhm.
about when I hear a church, when I was attending monthly meetings with our local churches, and somebody's like, "Well, we're not going to do that because we've always done it this way." And you're like,
Yep.
"Well, I think the other key, I love the idea of the
White red
embroidery
flag.
floss
Mhm.
and untangling it. And I think that I also love the idea that when we're talking through scenarios, that your first one might not get you to that point. So the idea
Right.
of sticking with it, not only for our mental health professional in our local camps, but also this idea that scenario planning, you might try it once. And anytime you try something once, it's not, you're going to fail at many things the first time you do it.
Totally.
We have stilts at camp. We have wooden stilts. We have something called battle stilts at Pierce Williams, where people get on stilts and try and knock each other off stilts. It is a tradition. It's a tradition that I ask every year whether we should keep. They say we should. The first time you get on stilts, you don't know how to walk. You don't,
Right.
the first time you try to juggle, unless you're super amazing, you're not going to be able
Mhm.
to. And the first time you work through these scenarios, it's going to be a challenge. You're going to feel frustrated. You're going to try and do it by yourself because that's the way most people try new things is they start. They start. I would love to do scenario clubs where we recruit some of our listeners and have them join us to walk them through a scenario that they're interested in, right? Because I think that when you do it in community, the more different facilities, like as I look at the three of us or different positions, you look at these scenarios and you're like, oh, well, what if this? Oh my
Mhm.
gosh. Like I hadn't thought about black market medication, but I'm like, oh, for sure that would be a thing.
Mhm.
Like for sure. But it is fascinating to the stick to itness of an idea. And KJ, when you change something, I have a theory that it's 3 years. You need to get through three
Agreed.
years.
Yep.
The first year people complain. The second year, fewer people complain. And some people are like, hey, that's a great idea. And the third year, nobody talks about it. And it just becomes part of the we've always done it that way.
Yep.
Or and I'm not sure. Yeah. Short memories. People have short memories. I think as
So,
we yeah, go ahead.
well, I was just gonna sort of take this idea. We have taken a scenario and we've kind of like thrown some things out. And I wanted to ask the question, so to you all and to myself, that so in this scenario planning, we do this thing where we do best case scenario and maybe worst case scenario and wild card scenario. Do we want to maybe talk a little bit about what those are for folks, maybe if they don't have the book, when we're thinking about creating scenarios and planning?
I think the value is yes, we do want to talk about it. That's the answer to your question. Here's my take on it is that the best case scenario, as you're planning scenarios, you need to think in positive terms. You need to think in, and best case doesn't mean positive. It could just mean the best case that's going to happen if this thing happens. And the worst case is literally worst case scenario. There was a TV show called This Is Us, and the one couple had a worst case scenario thing where they would literally, like, when they were talking about one of their kids, it'd be like, what worst case scenario? And then they would literally say they become a murderer or something like that. And you're like, well, that's not going to happen. Right. And so, like, it really puts into perspective where they are in the moment. And then the wild card scenario. I think with scenarios, it's this idea that you have you have to think through different outcomes because the idea isn't that we're predicting the future. We are
Right.
creating multiple futures that and moving towards the one that we most want to exist. And the wild card might end up being that.
And you might not know that at the beginning.
Right.
And it might be through processing or talking or collaborating with people that you're like, oh, I had no idea, but this actually would be the best for the outcome that, you know, um, I think that's a really great point, Joe, just like thinking through that. And so I'm wondering, and we don't have to move this way, but if we want to take a driver and do a best, worst, and wild card, just to give an example of what that looks like, for folks who are curious.
So do we need another scenario?
Yeah. Do you have, we sort of talked about mine. We sort of talked about KJ's. Do we want to talk about one of the ones that you brought
what
up?
you
I know
got,
you brought
Joe?
up a couple.
Sure. Let's do a camp merger scenario. So it's a bit smaller on that scale. I typed in the scenario that was, I'm interested in the future of my nonprofit summer camp and year-round retreat facility related to merging and taking on the management and oversight of two other local not-for-profit summer camp facilities that are summer camp only and open for 4 months each year. That's the prompt I gave. And so without knowing what Poe gave us, that's my scenario. So
And
10 years from now, I wake up and this comes to me. Part of my thing is that it comes to me as an idea or something that we need to do within the next 100 to 150 days.
can I ask a clarifying question?
Yeah, for sure.
And I think you might have said it, and the merger, the two camps are coming to merge with you. And by that I mean, would you be the, let's say, executive director of this, or is it three entities coming together with three different executive directors? Does that make sense? Like,
Yeah, it is. The other two camps have approached us. The other two boards of directors have approached us about merging
okay.
and taking over their operating their facilities.
And all of them own their own facilities.
Let's say that for sure.
I mean, it's just helpful for
Yeah.
for thinking through. And
Let's
then my
say
other
that.
question is, how are they all near each other? Are they touching properties or are they far away from each other?
That's great. They're all within both of the other sites, and this is real life. So if my brother is listening to this podcast or somebody from the other camp that knows who they are, they're both within a half-hour drive of my facility. So three camp, and they're less than an hour. They might be an hour and 10 minutes apart from each other. So we're not terribly removed from each other.
But also, you're not sharing
A border, a property
border
line,
or anything like that.
No. There is as a reference, there are two United Church of Canada camps in Alberta that literally share the driveway and then split off onto two sides. And I have no idea why they just run together.
What I love about this scenario, though, is these are conversations that have been happening as well, or I think are very close to happening for some. And so I think it's a really great setup, and knowing sort of that in this scenario that we're setting up, two boards are approaching a center about this possible merge. And so I'm asking questions to kind of get an idea about this, right?
Yeah.
That's how my brain goes. One of the other questions is the camp that has been, let's say it's your camp, are you the most healthy? And is that why they came to you? Would be a question.
The answer is yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So using this as a real case scenario, and KJ, if you have clarifying questions, I'll take them in a second. Yes, we're the healthiest. We're the only year-round facility. We have done the most capital investment of our facility, right? So we don't have a capital deficit, meaning that, we don't have deferred capital projects that are in the multi-million dollars to try and fix. And our camper numbers and retreat numbers are good, right? This is where setting up that scenario. Other clarifying questions, KJ?
Yeah, are you merging staff? Are you just gaining their property? Are you...
The boards of, in my mind, the boards of directors have come and said, we want you to run our facilities. Neither of them they each have one full-time staff that is year-round.
Okay.
But they don't have any other, compared with 5 full-time staff at our facility.
Okay.
And all of that is on the table, whether you keep that person or whether it's redundant now that you're merging into one organization.
Yeah, what's the why? Like, why do they want to merge?
Mm-hmm.
Why is...
I think that's an imagination thing. I think I think that they would want to merge because they feel like they're not reaching their full potential.
Okay.
I think an interesting, and let's go more hypothetical than only because they say we want to merge, but then what I hear is we want you to run our centers. And so in my mind, that puts up a couple red flags.
Mm.
In my mind, like the immediate thing is I would love to do a property site assessment and go in and look at both of them, and also look at the organization from the operations assessment as well, and look at all of that and say, after that, are both of these viable? Or maybe, which is like a really hard thing, is maybe one of them, it's not viable, and it's actually going to, if the merge happens, it's actually going to sink everyone. And potentially, best case scenario in this is that maybe you end up selling one or two of the properties and actually merging and bringing on that staff and bringing them onto your site. And then, like in this, I'm trying to think, and it's
Yeah.
kind of wild card because it isn't necessarily best case scenario for the other two.
Mm.
But for the health of, I would say, that area, if you could end up, let's say, selling those properties, bringing on that staff, and maybe there's some property that's near you that you could expand on a little bit, and then you have some capital that you could really invest in marketing, in community relationship building, especially because you're merging three into one. How do we really invite those three into, let's say, this one space to make them feel like this space is going to be home?
Yeah.
And
I think with the information we have, I think we can go through best, worst, and wild card. And
yeah.
so in my mind, and you two can push back on this, I think the best case scenario is that we merge, and that can mean a variety of different things. In my mind, it has to be a single board of directors. That's a wholly other conversation. We merge, and all three camps become part of a larger organization and serve the children of Southwestern Ontario to better than they ever have. That's a best case scenario, that they're all healthy. We find grant money and other money to update facilities and get them to the place. It's not implying that we're turning them into year-round facilities. It's just implying that we're managing those facilities from a single office. Best case scenario, everyone goes happy, and we don't have to lose the other two positions. We become a team of people who can then operate three facilities at that rate.
Yeah. And I think sort of my brain went into wild card because I don't necessarily think that what I was thinking about is like necessarily the worst case scenario is like, no, and then you all go under or something. But
well, no, but there was you brought up a worst case scenario that I don't think you put as worst case, which is that it brings us down, right? The worst case scenario in my mind is that you agree to a merge, and then it drags all three facilities down to where all three facilities have to close. Right? Like that's a worst case to me, is that you don't know the weight of the history or of legal lawsuits, historical lawsuits, anything of that nature. And in a worst case scenario, it would be that you merge and it just doesn't work for anyone, and you don't get out of it fast enough, right? So many times nonprofit boards of directors are not the fastest moving thing. And because they don't think about the future. Hey, I know this great podcast people should listen to, but like in my mind, that's the worst case scenario, where all three just cease to exist.
And I feel you guys are so business professional, because in my mind, I'm thinking about the ridiculousness, right? And I'm like, someone comes in and they burn all the camps to the ground, and there's no insurance money, and
wow, I thought I had worst case scenario. Look at KJ coming up.
I love it.
We said think about the ridiculous, right? So that was my worst case scenario, is like, what is the absolute like most wild thing that could possibly happen?
Wow.
So
I think about stakeholders or families that have been for generations saying like a big F you.
right.
And really like actually purposely
burning
having
it to the ground.
well,
Yeah.
that and or purposely
Undermining.
like undermining, going
Sure.
online and starting campaigns against and
Yeah.
actually being the the fire metaphorically that burns everyone down,
Totally.
or literally goes in
And
and
burns
does
it to
that.
the
I
ground.
mean, who knows, right? Yeah.
I think that, so that's worst case. There's a variety of them that we can play out, none of which I want to try and make true. I
Mm.
think the wild card is that there's so many things that can go right and or sideways.
Yeah.
But I think one of the wild cards is that each site becomes like a trap, like that you figure out that each site has their own strengths and they just take on very different personalities,
Mm.
which is fine within a larger organization. That's one of the wild cards I would play out. I'd play out a wild card where, yeah, you have to sell one because you do the assessment. Because I'm not going to merge with someone unless if they, if you do the assessment and the camp is just not feasible, right? If the investment needed in a facility is so great that it makes almost zero sense to invest in it, then I think that one of the wild cards is, like you said, Jess, is that two survive and one dies. The biggest wild card in this is how alumni react from camps that have been
Yeah.
around since 1903 for the one camp, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the other two camps are the late 50s, early 60s, right?
Yeah.
Like, how do you get people to buy in?
And I think part of that too, I think sometimes boards or larger organizations choose to not be transparent and it ends up biting them. And I think going to stakeholders, going to those families ahead of time and saying, here's the reality of what is going on at our center or our camp. And
Yeah.
and giving the data. And it's like, here's the reality of here's what we've seen over the past 20 years. Like let's say it's a decline or whatever. And giving the truth and saying like this is what it is. And we could have an opportunity to partner.
Yeah.
But we want feedback from you. And this doesn't mean that magically we're not going to move this way, but we want your feedback, because if this is the first time these families or stakeholders have ever heard of it, they're going to feel blindsided and they're not going to be supportive. But if it's at the point where they're looking at this, clearly there have been things that have been happening over time, in my mind, that would make you need to merge. And so you would hope that people know this, and they might not, because if I'm just a family sending my kid to this camp, actually, which has happened, my daughter has been going to this camp, and it's a camp that I've been involved in for a very long time. And we were all blindsided that they canceled camp.
Yeah.
And there was no transparency. And so it has created a lot of mistrust. And so I don't want that situation to happen anywhere else. And it is so easy to be honest up front than to not be honest and transparent and try to cover things and fix things and apologize later. I know we say ask permission,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
whole
Ask
it's not.
forgiveness.
It's not
Yeah.
in some situations.
I think when hearing you talk, I think about this idea that if people are new to something, if an idea is new, because nonprofits are horrible at sharing the bad and
Mhm.
really good at sharing the good.
Totally.
And so when those struggles are happening, if you're not sharing them, people are always like, well, I thought everything was fine.
Right.
And part of me is like, I have this idea from 20 years of being here that I plant a whole bunch of seeds that I don't know if they're
Mhm.
gonna germinate. Ideas that are go around. And I was like, oh, what if we just promoted the other two camps on our website without asking them? Looking for something different than Pierce Williams? You have these other United Church camps that are local as well. I don't need to ask Kennesary. I don't need to ask Kimoki whether I can do that. I can just put links up to say, hey, parents, we want you to get the best camp possible for your child. and we might not be it.
Hmm.
Right. And I think that talking, because we're always, and I think in a future of this nature, things of that, if we've already done some work together, it's easier in the future
Hmm.
to come together.
Well, then you're already building relationships. Like, part of me is like, well, maybe you should tell them you're posting that on your site just because it's a great relationship building collaboration thing. And then also, you don't have a family member calling and saying, oh, I saw on Pierce Williams to come here. And then they're like, what? But I do love that idea. I say that, like, I'm a pastor in an Episcopal church, and there are people who come in every Sunday, and I tell them this might not be the right church for you. I can tell you how much I love
Mhm.
this church and why I love it,
Mhm.
but like that doesn't mean it's going to work for you. And that's the truth. I'm not going to lie. And so you have to find what's right for you. And that might be my church.
Yeah.
That might be the one down the street. And for me, it's more important that they find a place where they can have that relationship with God. And in this situation, for me, it's more important that the camp staff member or the parent or the kid finds the right place that works for them.
Yeah, for sure.
I love this conversation because the world that we live in is such an instant gratification society. And so this idea of think 10 years in the future for for me and maybe for others can be really challenging because I'm like, "Oh, okay." But when we break it down to the what now, it's fantastic. And so I like hearing you guys talk, go back and forth about these possibilities and then say, "Oh, well, we can be transparent. We can do this." Those are things we can do now to help with that 10-year plan. And so I love that.
And I think
I will,
in our plan, we have our next episode is going to discuss analyzing the implications of scenarios and how
Mhm.
to process them. And I think that's what we're getting into now.
mhm.
And we don't need to so
Yeah.
much right now at this moment.
Yeah. I was just going to add to kind of wrap up. What is one thing you're taking away from today that you didn't think about?
I think the concept of a wild card and really figuring out when I'm doing the scenario planning, is this a best scenario? Is this a worst scenario? Or is this a wild card and there could be multiple things intertwined in this potential possibility?
Hmm.
I'm taking away the idea that no matter what my worst case scenario is, KJ will always have a better worst case scenario.
Yep. That's young millennial Gen Z for you right there.
I'm taking away this idea of getting even more creative instead of I get very practical and like realist.
Yeah, yeah.
And in this world and in my other world, like I'm an improv comedian, like I can go there and
Be
I'm like,
ridiculous.
Jess, be ridiculous.
Yeah.
Be ridiculous.
There,
At
nobody's
first.
checking, no
Be
one's grading
ridiculous
you.
at first. Yeah.
Exactly. And so this is the time to do that.
That's
We can
great.
get real all the time. Well, thank you so
Awesome.
much for joining us today. Our next session, we're going to be talking about those early warning signs and strategic flexibility. And just to recap, I'm Jess Selfring Roberts. You can find me and Episcopal Camp and Conference Centers on Instagram at Episcopal CCC. And you can find all the things on our website, episcopalccc.org. KJ?
Yeah, if you too have the worst possible case scenarios and want to share them with me, you can find me at kj@phantomlakeymca.org. All the Phantom Lake YMCA is all over the socials, Instagram, Facebook, all that fun stuff.
Awesome. And if you need to reach out to me, you can do that directly, joe@campisbetter.com. You can follow everything Pierce Williams does on almost all the socials. We are Camp is Better because life is good. Camp is better.
Well, and with that, we look forward to camping ahead with you all next in our next session. Take care.
See you later.
Thanks for listening to Camp Ahead, exploring the futurology of the summer camp industry. Don't forget to check out our contact information and show notes at gocamp.pro/campahead. Camp Ahead is part of the Go Camp Pro podcast network. Find a podcast for camp pros of every age and stage at gocamp.pro/podcast. Hey Camp Pros, we love that our industry is built on sharing. In order to foster that spirit, we ask that whenever you get something great from a conference session, one of these podcasts, from the Camp Pros group on Facebook, wherever else, that you give credit where credit is due. That way, people can feel comfortable about sharing their best practices and continue to make all of our camps better. Thanks so much.